Hello everyone, let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about an introduction to the microbes. The first thing we need is a working definition for exactly what a microbe is. We're going to define a microbe as a single-celled microscopic organism or acellular particle. The microbes are found in all three domains of living things. That includes the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. And the eukarya includes things like the fungi and the protists. We also include viruses and prions as the acellular types of microbes. The viruses don't have their own domain, neither do the prions, and that's because these acellular particles are not considered to be alive. You'll notice that I have an asterisk next to the bacteria and the viruses, and that's because it turns out that bacteria and viruses make up the majority of the pathogenic microbes that we'll be discussing this term. A pathogen is simply an organism that's capable of causing disease in humans and other living things. Now, you may have learned at some point in your education the old system of taxonomy that used to be used to describe all of the living things on planet Earth. The old system of taxonomy included the kingdom, the phylum, the class, the order, the family, the genus, and the species. 7 different categories of organization, and all living things on the planet fell into those 7 categories according to their characteristics. We now use a different system, a system that was developed in the 1970s by a scientist named Carl Woese. It was Woese who came up with the system of 3 domains to categorize all of the living things. It doesn't mean that we don't refer to kingdom or phylum anymore. We do, particularly in the eukarya domain. It just means that we use broader categories to break down all of the living things into groups: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. On this slide, you can see that the artist has broken down the eukarya group into 4 smaller categories: plants and animals, fungi, and an unusual group known as the protists. The eukarya, unlike the bacteria and the archaea, have a much broader diversity of organisms and organismal characteristics. On this slide, we can see what's called a phylogenetic tree drawn, representing the 3 domains of living things. You can see the bacteria here in blue, then the archaea in red, and the eukarya, or what is sometimes called eukaryota, in purple. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this type of drawing, this is referred to as a phylogenetic tree. You may also hear this referred to as the tree of life. Phylogenetic trees are very common when we want to make comparisons between the evolutionary relationships among organisms. Phylogenetic trees depict those relationships across time. Now, the way we read this type of tree is by beginning down here at the base of the tree trunk, if you will. At the base, we imagine that there is a record of a living organism that was the very first living organism to appear on planet Earth many, many billions of years ago. This organism then was the ancestor of every other living thing that has ever lived on planet Earth. Now, we refer to this original living thing as a common ancestor, or sometimes the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA, last universal common ancestor. This is the ancestral organism, again, that through evolution gave rise to all other organisms. The best evidence that we have to date suggests that that first life form appeared on this planet approximately 4 billion years ago. If you travel up the trunk of the tree, you hit this branching point, or what we refer to as a node. Something happened at this point in time that took that ancestral organism and split it, sent one group in one direction and another group in another direction. Now, we don't know the details of this split. We don't know why this population of organisms was divided and sent along different evolutionary paths, but we do know the results. From that node, from that event in the tree of life, the bacteria emerged. They took their own path up the tree, if you will. They took their own path of genetic diversion. They became different from that last universal common ancestor. They started on their own developmental journey. And you can see that from that one blue branch right here emerged all kinds of other branches as time went by. There isn't one kind of bacteria. There are many, many different types of bacteria. And in fact, bacteria are still evolving today. What we know from the phylogenetic tree is that the bacteria were the first domain to evolve from that original ancestral life form. Now, if we head up the other branch from that first node, we find both the archaea and the eukarya. Notice that the archaea evolved first, followed by the eukarya, or the eukaryota. Now, the fact that both archaea and eukarya appear on this same branch tells us something. In other words, the way you would read that on a phylogenetic tree is that the archaea are more closely related to the eukarya than they are to the bacteria. The bacteria evolved first, followed by the archaea, followed by the eukarya. We have evidence that suggests that the bacteria evolved about 3.5 billion years ago. The archaea, approximately 2.5 billion years ago, and the eukarya, about 2 billion years ago. Again, this was when the domain first appeared on the planet. Each domain has been evolving ever since. Something to note about this phylogenetic tree is this. Microbes have ruled for most of Earth's history. Microbes, single-celled, microscopic organisms. Both the bacteria and the archaea, and some of the eukarya, fall into that microbial definition. Microbes rule on this planet. Now, in terms of the domain name archaea, some of you may have learned in your education a term archaebacteria. Originally, the archaea were considered to be a part of the bacterial domain. They were thought to be their own sort of subgroup of bacteria. Again, it was Carl Woese in the 1970s who discovered that the archaea were distinct enough, evolutionarily speaking. They had their own unique characteristics, their own genetics, their own evolutionary history that made them not a type of bacteria, but their own domain. Remember, phylogenetic trees like this one are works in progress. Evolution has not stopped on planet Earth, it continues. The bacterial domain is expanding, the archaeal domain is expanding, and the eukarya domain is expanding. The other thing to notice is that there are no viruses on this phylogenetic tree, and that's because viruses are acellular. They are particles, and they are not considered to be alive. Now, when we think about the cellular life on this planet in the three domains, one of the first things that we need to know is what's referred to as the cell theory. Now, this is a theory that was developed over many, many decades by a group of scientists. No one scientist is credited with the development of this theory, but it's a theory that we still refer to today because it's part of our foundational understanding of cellular life. The theory has two parts. The first part states that all living organisms are composed of cells. The second part states that all cells come from previously existing cells. In other words, you can't just pull a cell out of thin air. A new cell is created when an old cell divides. So all cells across all three domains in the tree of life are very different from each other. As you already know, if you think about the cells just in your own body, they're very, very different from one another. Your skin cells are very different from your skeletal muscle fibers or your neurons or the epithelium that lines your intestine or the retinal cells that are in the back of your eye. All cells are very different from each other. But there are some characteristics that they all share. So it doesn't matter if you're looking at a microbial cell, bacteria, for example, or you're looking at an archaeal cell, or you're looking at a plant or an animal or a fungus or a protist. It doesn't matter. If it's a cell and it exists on planet Earth, we can count on it to have 4 characteristics, and I've listed them here. All cells are surrounded by a plasma membrane. All cells contain a gel-like fluid material that we call cytoplasm. All cells use DNA as their genetic material. And all cells contain machine-like structures called ribosomes that do the work of protein production. On this slide, we have a couple of drawings on the left-hand side, and we have some actual micrograph images on the right-hand side. These were images that were taken through the lens of an electron microscope, very, very powerful microscope. If we start over on the left, up at the top, we have a drawing of a very generic looking prokaryotic cell. Prokaryotes are single-celled organisms, so both bacteria and archaea are considered prokaryotic. They are single-celled and they lack organelles. If you look inside this cell, and they've cut part of it away for us, you can see that there's not a lot drawn in here. It's pretty basic. We can see the plasma membrane, and that's depicted in blue. We can see the cytoplasm, that's depicted in yellow. We can see the DNA, that's depicted in green. And we can see the ribosomes. That's depicted as the little red dots all the way through the cytoplasm. Over here on the right, again, these are actual electron microscope images of prokaryotic cells. These could be bacteria or archaea. And when you look, they look a little bit different than the drawing. They're not quite as simplistic as the drawing, but the idea is the same. The structure is pretty basic in these very ancient organisms, these evolutionarily ancient organisms. We have the outer plasma membrane, we have cytoplasm with all kinds of ribosomes in it, and we have the DNA. We have the outer membrane, we have cytoplasm, tiny dots of ribosomes throughout, and in this image, the DNA is over to the side. It's been pulled over to the side of the cell. Now compare that with this drawing on the lower left. This is sort of a generic eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotes are single-celled sometimes, but can also be multicellular, like you and I. Eukaryotic cells also contain organelles, and that's what you can see in this drawing. So, like the prokaryotic cell, eukaryotic cells have a membrane. You can see that in blue. They have cytoplasm. You can see that in orange. You can just make out the tiny dots that represent the ribosomes. And you can see the DNA, the genetic material, in green. So the exact same components that we saw in the prokaryotic cell. But there are additional structures that you find in a eukaryotic cell that you won't find in a prokaryotic cell. And of course, those are the organelles. Notice that the DNA in a eukaryotic cell is housed in a nucleus. That's what's represented by this circular structure. There are these layers of what's called endoplasmic reticulum surrounding the nucleus. There is Golgi apparatus. There are mitochondria. There are lysosomes and peroxisomes. All kinds of little structures, again called organelles, that make a eukaryotic cell very distinct from a prokaryotic cell. If we look at the EM image over here, you can see the nucleus here in the center of this particular cell. The endoplasmic reticulum is visible in a couple of places, right up close to the nucleus. And then you can see mitochondria, these circular structures. The Golgi apparatus is out here somewhere. There are lysosomes and peroxisomes. There are organelles in this cell. One other thing that I want you to notice in these drawings and these electron micrograph images is the size comparison. Prokaryotic cells, again, bacteria and archaea, they're much smaller than eukaryotic cells. And if you think about it, that makes sense. The eukaryotic cell just has more stuff in it. It has the four things that all cells have, but it also has organelles, and it needs more space to house those organelles.